All right, my English teacher friends. So I have for you yet another writing workshop. And in this particular piece, we're going to focus on Steve Cutt's wonderful short film entitled Mobile World, which you can find for free on YouTube. It's a real quick film. It's about 4 minutes long, and it's a fantastic, fantastic piece. So I've said this in my latest videos. In my Gen Ed classes and in AP Lang, I start the introduction to my templates with argument first. So the expository mode of argument first, because I find it's the easiest entry point into my templates. And in part because the textual support, so the second premise in the syllogistic body paragraphs, comes from the student's recall. And we're not using sources for synthesis. We have no literature in front of us, no rhetorical pieces. It's just the student's brain. And I just find it's easier to get them to finagle and pull the strings of my templates with argument first. But I'm killing many birds with a few stones here. So, in the last video I made, we were talking about the relevancy gap in education. Why is there such high levels of disengagement in the classroom? And I'm using that one very first essay of the academic year. So, at the time of recording this, it's September 11th, 2022. I've had my students for a week now. So all the icebreaker stuff is done. We're getting into some hardcore nuts and bolts composition. So I'm starting with that relevancy gap, and I'm excited to have the Plato's Plato discussion about why disengagement is so high these days, especially last year. Why were kids so checked out? Another thing I want to talk about is cell phone use and the mobile devices. And this particular piece, Steve Cutt's Mobile World, really gets us into some good conversations about the devices and the cell phones and the distractibility of them and the impact on culture. So in my family, I have a 19-year-old son and a 17-year-old daughter and a wife. And when we have conflict, we call real talk. I'll say to my son, Logan, for example, I'll be like, "Hey, Logan, we need to have real talk, man. We got some beef between us here. There's some things that are bothering me." So if someone calls real talk in the family, it means that you're going to have probably an uncomfortable conversation, but you're going to air it out and have an adult conversation. So I'm calling early in the academic year for real talk with my students. I want to know why the relevancy gap exists. I want to know as a practitioner what I can do to close it. And then last year, cell phones drove me nuts. I think, as a lot of educators in the US felt, the cell phones were really intrusive and impeded kids from learning. So, as my district embraces a new cell phone policy, I want to have a conversation with the kids about it instead of just slipping it on them and saying, "It is the way it is. The Board of Education passed down this policy, and our principal is enforcing us to enforce it, and that's just the way it is." I want to have a conversation because I feel sometimes, in the world of education, administrators do to teachers and then teachers do to kids, and it feels wildly unfair and unjust and arbitrary sometimes. So I want to have those conversations very early on to have the real talk. So let's dive in. I'm going to stick to the status quo for this writing workshop. So as I already alluded to, we're going to tackle arguments. We'll discuss the declarative and the inverted thesis for my template to get at the introductory paragraph. And then, as always, we'll tackle body paragraphs syllogistically. And I have a whole bunch of models and exemplars that I wrote for you that you can use with your students or just have to inform your instruction so that you can host your own writing workshop. So here's my prompts. In Steve Cutt's short film entitled Mobile World, he makes a rather unique social commentary about the American value system with regards to our mobile devices. Defend, qualify, challenge, or refute his position in your response. Give very specific textual support to build your argument. So when I teach argument, I teach the rhetorical modes of or stances of defend, qualify, challenge, or refute. I know old school AP Lang would use that language, but just for the sake of introducing my templates and the positions, the stances that they can take, I use the old school language, and then I'll cloak my language so that it's more closely akin to, the last 4 or 5 years of FRQ3s for AP Lang as we get there. But early in the academic year, it doesn't matter. I'm just teaching them how to write and how to think a little bit. So, all right. As always, I'm going to tell you this. You got to Bob Ross your instruction. So I wrote all the models and exemplars in this writing workshop for my students. So imagine students come into my room. We have our Plato's Plato discussion about the movie. We watch it. We talk about Steve Cutt's exigence. What's his authorial intent? How does he construct meaning? What's his universal truth? And we have all that wild discussion about it. And we're filling whiteboards and easel pad paper with all these brilliant ideas that the kids are coming up with. It's just fodder for textual support and fodder for getting anchored in a thesis statement. We're basically pre-writing through conversation. So I love it when teachers position themselves as the expert writer in the classroom. And just like Bob Ross always got up to that canvas with his, in his easel, paint with your students. So if you are students in my class, I would say, all right, guys, today we're going to write the Steve Cotts Mobile World Essay argument. I'm going to teach you argumentation. I wrote for you 3 declarative theses and 3 inverted theses. Here they are: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. On your mark, get set, go. You've seen it 6 times. Do it. And it totally demystifies the process. You'll have very little confusion, and you're going to bring out the inner writer in a lot of students. The problem is, I think kids have great ideas. They have brilliant ideas, but they don't know how to think on paper. And when we equip them with templates and teachers willing to Bob Ross their composition, then the glory is there. So you're going to get some good writing. So the first question is this: how do I write the introduction? You can declare or invert. Let's unpack what we mean by that. So essentially, we're being asked an essential question. Do you agree, disagree, or are you on the fence with regards to Steve Cutt's thesis? You can begin with the thesis. Start with your argument with regards to Cutts. Is he on the mark, off the mark, or is he kind of in the middle? From there, you sprinkle in your tier 2 level vocabulary. And what I mean by that is your average run-of-the-mill SAT level words. But you'll see in my models and exemplars, it's more than just academic to get the voice point for, or the sophistication point for AP language students. I think you really need to teeter-totter balance the colloquial, the vernacular, and the academic and keep that very tight. So I'll model how to do that. So in my class, I run a word study academy all year long. Tons of vocabulary instruction because the vocabulary void is real. There's a chasm in student vocabs in my 21 plus years of teaching, and it's just, getting exponentially larger and larger and larger, that chasm. So sentence constructs is something that I'm going to begin to talk about even in the second week of school with my students. Strunk and White, in their seminal text called Write It Right, make the assertion that there's 12 different ways to construct a single sentence. So you're going to see me manipulate my syntax and hopefully make no punctuation errors. I'm going to make sure all my students have mastered the basics of grammar, punctuation, and syntax. So for voice, rhythm, and flow, you'll see me wield a wild variety of sentence constructs. And then each introduction is going to be exactly 4 sentences long, no more, no less. So begin with thesis, tier 2, sentence constructs, exactly 4 sentences. You can flip that triangle upside down and end with the thesis. That's what we would call an inverted thesis. So you begin with context, background, maybe a hook analogy, and as you funnel it down towards the 4th sentence, boop, drop your thesis right in that 4th sentence. Same thing, tier 2, sentence constructs. So I wrote a whole bunch for you to kind of give you an idea of how to do this. And I'll walk you through. So I'll read this one from start to finish, and then I'll unpack it for you. Unfortunately, the mobile world has created a tangible human disconnect. Gone are the days of giving someone your undivided attention, and gone are the days of home-cooked meals with families gathering around the table to discuss the joys and frustrations of their day. With the advent of mobile devices, man has grown increasingly distant from man. Steve Cutts has it right. We're a bunch of mobile addicts, not even aware of what we're doing. So let's start with thesis. Thesis. Where are you? Are you first or are you last? Clearly, we're last, so this is inverted. You can see here in my models and exemplars, I'm not a big fan of hooks and analogies. I don't think a lot of kids have the poetic muse in them to pull that off very successfully, especially our struggling and emerging writers. Just a straight up context background. Poker game, show your cards, right? 3 sentences, hit me with a thesis. So the vocab is really good in this, tangible, disconnect. But look, it's not over the top. You know, the student, who is me, I stay in my lane, right? I stay in my wheelhouse. Undivided is a nice word. Advent. Uh, and that's pretty much it. But you'll notice there's a little mix of colloquial and vernacular in here as well, which gives it that nice spunk and flair and pizzazz that you need for the sophistication point. Note the sentence constructs right out of the gate. Unfortunately, comma, the mobile world has created a tangible human disconnect. Look at the next sentence and how that flows. Long sentence, middle comma. You got some adjective clauses, some independent clauses, even have a dash down here, right? So my students in time will know the names of all of those 12 sentences. They will be masters of the hyphen, the dash, the comma, the colon, the semicolon, the comma, the period. To get sophistication, you can't be making mistakes, and you got to be able to, you know, wield your syntax with purpose. So that's all stuff that I teach in my Nuance Academy that I run from, well, as soon as we're done with icebreakers in the beginning of the year, we get into that hardcore stuff. So here's another one. This one is going to declare the thesis. Steve Cuss is just another boomer bemoaning about the terrible woes of mobile culture. So, all right, we took our stance. We're clearly going to argue against Steve Cutts. So, thesis dropped. Now we got to have context background, tier 2 sentence constructs. Clearly, this is not an all or nothing proposition like he proposes. While, yes, a lot of people have developed terrible habits as the result of their devices, this technology has affected a lot of positive change in our society. Objectively speaking, our mobile world is a far better place to live in than a world without this level of technological advancement. So taking cuts head on. Note, in example 1 and 2, I don't want students getting into their reasons. I don't want them to have any textual support in here at all. You're basically showing your cards. You're showing your poker face like in a card game. You're front loading the argument. So down in the body paragraphs, in terms of creating the line of reasoning, we would want to have a conversation about how are things better with than without, right? And then get into this all or nothing proposition, right? So Cuts paints one very black and white portrait of the mobile crisis, but he doesn't point the other side of the coin, paint the other side of the coin. So here's another one. Mobile devices have created a country full of lemmings. Unfortunately, the vast majority of people are glued to their tech devices and are consequently oblivious to their surroundings. So much of life is being missed because a large swath of our population has an unhealthy addiction to their mobile devices. Steve Cutt's depiction of this phenomenon is spot on. So let's go back to number 1 as a training wheel, as a scaffold, because it's early in the academic year, I'm telling my kids, say Steve Cutts to indicate your thesis. When you're dropping your thesis, just say things like Steve Cutts has it right. Steve Cutts is just another boomer bemoaning about the terrible woes of mobile culture. And then in this inverted one, Steve Cutts' depiction of this phenomena is spot on. And then in the fourth one, Steve Cutt's portrayal of the mobile world is completely hyperbolic and out of touch with reality. So it doesn't matter. You say it first or you say it last. Context, background, tier two level vocab, sentence constructs. Let's go back to the third one. Vocab is nice in there. Concepts like lemmings. My students know about that from their psychology class. Um, Words like phenomena, depiction, but you have a blend of the colloquial or the vernacular as well. The sentence constructs aren't anything over the top, but this has good voice rhythm and flow. Ultimately, our struggling and emerging writers overuse the independent clause and the short, simple declarative sentence. So their flow, their rhythm reads like da 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 da, and we want to break them of that. So model, 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 Bob Ross your instruction. So let's take a look at this one from start to finish. It's a declarative one. Steve Cutt's portrayal of the mobile world is completely hyperbolic and out of touch with reality. Quite clearly, one cannot blame mere devices for the decay of society. Scapegoating one sole source for the deterioration of human connectivity is not only short sighted, but it is wrong. So, very strong language taken on Cuts. There are a multitude of other reasons why man is disconnected from man, right? So again, don't get into your textual support in the introduction. So you're going to save that for the first premise and second premise of the syllogistic body paragraphs. So out of the gate, all of these kids are strong. I wrote these. I call myself a kid. I'm just pretending to be a kid in my class, right? So I think any AP reader, if you're doing this with an AP class, would say, yep, Christian he set himself up to get the sophistication point out of the gate. He's strong. If he can hold this for the duration of the paper, he's going to get the sophistication point. This is good stuff. So that's what I'm keying in on. And, in reading thousands of anchor papers from Lang and Lit, I'm finding that teeter-totter balance, colloquial, vernacular, academic, punctuate correctly. That's important. You're in contention for that elusive sophistication point. So here's one more. Mobile devices quite clearly have affected more good in our society than bad. In fact, humans are more connected now than they've ever been. Because of these technological advancements, people have unfettered access to human connection. Steve Cutt's portrayal is off the mark. Mobile devices offer far more that is positive than negative, right? So defend, qualify, challenge, or refute. Those are your rhetorical stances. State it last for an inverted, state it first for a declarative. Sentence constructs, tier two, context, background, 4 sentences every single time. So you're not doing that just for this particular essay. Students will do this across the expository modes all academic year, and then they move on to teachers who also use my templates, and it totally demystifies the writing process. And just as a tangential aside, I was doing some consulting this past summer with a group of teachers out in Fort Collins, Colorado, and their seniors walked into class one day. Teacher gave the assignment. They were supposed to do a literary analysis of the things they carried. And seniors, AP literature students, looked at blank sheets of paper and blank screens as if they'd never written an essay before in their lives. And I know in talking to teachers all the time, they're like, God, I hate that. These kids act like they've never written before in their lives. You give them templates and you Bob Ross your instruction. They will intuitively, instinctually know what to do every single time they sit down to write. They just don't have any paradigm. They don't have any framework upon which to write, and then it becomes a guessing game of what does teacher want. I remember doing that as a student. What does teacher want? And engaging in that guesswork. It's not what teachers want. It's what's good writing, and good thinking is good writing. So the next question we need to pose to ourselves is this: how do I write the body paragraphs? And as always, we're going syllogistically. In my YouTube channel, have done deep dives into the syllogistic method. If you want a long history on this, then go dig in through the archives of my YouTube channel. For now, I'm going to give a cursory kind of perfunctory overview of it, just so that you have a working knowledge of how to manipulate it and pull the strings of the syllogism for your students in terms of your explanation and your own Bob Rossing. But like I said, there's like probably 3 or 4 videos in my YouTube channel where I do a deep dive into it. So the syllogistic method comes from Aristotle. He ran a school called the Lyceum, and the rich aristocratic boys would go there to learn about polemics, oration, debate, wordsmithing, word wrangling, and they would throw out these juicy essential questions like, what is justice? And those of you that have read Plato's Republic, that classic seminal text, Plato's Republic, know that that's the essential question of the text. And these great philosophical thinkers would step to the mic and they would drop their definition of what is justice. Every single definition in that book is constructed in syllogistic format. So the philosopher is arguing from premise, premise, conclusion. So let me give you an example of a syllogism. If I say in premise 1, arsenic is deadly. Premise 2, my dog ate arsenic. Conclusion, my dog is going to die. You would all say, Christian, that is logical. Very sad, but very logical. And that's what we want from our students. Aristotle called it cogency. I use that word with my students. Bulletproof logic, computative, mathematic, locked in logical frameworks for their writing. And oftentimes, with FRQ3 on the Lang exam, or just when I'm teaching argument with Gen Ed students, most of the time students just love to present the second premise. And I'm going to do a webinar on this probably the end of September, beginning of October, where for FRQ1 and 2 for Lit and FRQ2 and 3 for Lang, the vast majority of the kids in the nation only present the second premise, and they're not meeting the demands of the assignment, and they're getting ding-donged on the rubric as the result. So I think that's one thing that teachers need to see. So if I can get permission, I don't know if the College Board will allow me to do it. I have to ask permission if I can use those sample papers in a webinar to dissect them for teachers, what the high scoring kids are doing and what the mediocre writers are doing, and then the kids that kind of tank bomb it, what they're doing. So, anyways, the syllogistic method, as far as constructing a body paragraph for argumentation. First premise is going to be an argument that contains a why reason. And that's why I was saying earlier for the thesis, don't get into the specifics of your reasons. Just drop the thesis. Defend, qualify, challenge, refute. Go no further. Don't get into your whys. So on FRQ1 on the Lang exam, the synthesis paper, the College Board says your argument must be central. 3 times they say it. And I say it all expository writing, even literary analysis and rhetorical analysis. Your argument must be central. So I want 3 sentences of dropping a why reason. Okay, so I'll model that. Textual support comes from the students' noodles. It comes from their heads. I am inviting them to write personally about this, reflect upon their own mobile use in this. So I modeled how to talk about yourself a little bit in this, because sometimes on FRQ3, the way the prompt is, kids are rendered to talk about themselves. And even though I'm like, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it, if you can avoid it, sometimes they have to. So this is an exercise, just a practice exercise where we're going to learn how to talk about ourselves intelligently on paper. And then the conclusion of the syllogistic body paragraph, not the conclusion paragraph of the essay, is the textual analysis. We have to link back to the prompt. We have to link back to the thesis. And then the first premise is a promise. And I'm going to articulate what I mean by that right now. So this is one body paragraph. It goes on to the next slide. I ran out of space here. Uh, Body paragraphs for my students, given that they're using templates, are typically 10 to 12 sentences long. I think that's an appropriate length for a body paragraph. So I tell my students those little itty bitty 4 or 5 sentence baggers that you write, it ain't cutting it. There's not enough support and not enough analysis. So 3 sentences to set up the why reason. So look at how this works. Due to mobile devices, most people do not allow themselves to feel the pangs of social awkwardness or silent pauses. The tendency is this: when things get a little weirder or uncomfortable, the cell phones come out to remove one from the moment. This especially happens in early dating scenarios. Okay, in writing workshops, so if I'm working with a student, I'm going to say, let's put this as a promise. First premise equals promise. You're going to talk about social awkwardness and silent pauses, how they're uncomfortable. And in moments of uncomfortable in contemporary mobile world societies, the cell phone comes out, and you're going to talk about an early dating scene. If I'm going to sustain my line of reasoning, that's all I can talk about. I can't talk about anything extraneous. And if I neglect to talk about these things, then I've also broken my line of reasoning. Fourth sentence begins the second premise. And I have my students transition, and they can steal this as a mentor clause. As an example, get right into your textual support. And as I said earlier, most kids start at the fourth sentence. Their body paragraphs begin at the fourth sentence. They're not arguing. They don't have their why reason. And if you don't have your why reason, you haven't met the demands of the assignment, and you're going to get hurt on your rubric score for that. As an example, I observed a couple in their early 30s on their first date at an upscale restaurant. Notice I said I, right? We're in argument here, FRQ3 kind of stuff. That's allowed, right? That's allowed. You can do that on the AP exam. But look, you don't want to overdo it. It's not about me. It's not about me. I keep telling my students that. Look at the language, how the tier 2, the colloquial and vernaculars at play, the sentence constructs are still at play. You got to keep it elevated. In overhearing parts of their conversation, it became clear that they met online and had only a few exchanges via text prior to the date. The man, in my opinion, was completely overdressed for the occasion, and as such, he exuded an air of awkwardness and an air of trying too hard. At one point in the evening, despite his date's insistence not to, he ordered an entire bottle of red wine. In that very moment, the woman's cell phone came out and she began scrolling. It was evident that he had made her feel uncomfortable. Do you see how this is all connected? Keep the promise. The textual support needs to be germane to the promise of the first premise, and you just keep it all lockstep order. Not fully realizing that what he had done, the man in turn reached inside his blazer pocket and pulled out his cell phone. Within the awkwardness of the moment, neither person addressed or attempted to communicate the issue at hand. Over the span of the next 5 minutes, his eyes were glued to his phone, and he chuckled to himself from time to time. His date, on the other hand, cast her eyes down and avoided the awkwardness at all cost. They sat like that until the waiter returned with their appetizers and drinks. All right, that's plenty of support. And this is the thing. This is why I say cap it at 12 sentences. When kids when you open the floodgates for students to talk about, things that they know very well, boom, you get like body paragraphs that are 26 sentences long. It's just it bloviates. It goes too long. It gets wayward. The line of reasoning is most likely to get broken. So cap it. In the end here, we got to go back to the prompt, right? We have to go back to the thesis, keep the promise of the first premise. The mobile world has created such situations. Instead of confronting situations head on, folks escape into their devices and deflect. The irony of the situation is this: the woman did not want the bottle of wine because she is in recovery. And I wrote this one, and it's a true story. I witnessed this, and the woman later in tears told the guy, "I'm in recovery, and I don't want your bottle of wine on the table. It makes me uncomfortable. Like, I'm trying to stay sober in life, and you didn't listen to me, and I feel kind of violated because you didn't listen to me. You didn't honor my word. I told you 3, 4 times. not to do it. So you can see here, if we bring it back, everything that's promised in order came in order. It's like a 1, 2, 3 hammer out, right? First premise, second premise, conclusion. Keep the line of reasoning, the vocab's up, it's perfectly punctuated, there's great sentence variation for voice, rhythm, and flow, and it's all there. So the question is this: what do I do next? Bust out another syllogism. Just do it all again. So my students write 4-paragraph essays: intro, two bodies, conclusion. That's what they do on all 6 FRQs, Lang and Lit combined, always 4 paragraphs. And in my Gen Ed classes, we only do 4-paragraph essays unless we're doing longer papers. But for like little practice things like this, 4 paragraphs is plenty. So check this one out. We're going to flip the perspective just to be fair and balanced for students. While mobile devices certainly have their failings and limitations, the benefits far outweigh the negatives. All right, so we're going to get into our why reasons, and it's a first premise, so it's going to be 3 sentences long. First, because of this technology, people are able to communicate at will with folks from all across the world. Second, instead of pulling families apart, devices actually bring families close together. So I tell my struggling and emerging students who have trouble organizing, enumerate your reasons. And usually you have 2 reasons in a syllogistic body paragraph, unless your one reason is just so pithy that you need your 10 sentences for it. So break this down into a promise. Technology is good because it allows people to communicate from all across the world. And 2, it allows families to stay close together. So we're going to disagree with Cuts' perspective. Note the mentor clause here again. Students can steal this from me. As you transition into your textual support, you need to trigger your reader into the idea that you're transitioning. As an example, my family left war-torn Syria nearly 5 years ago. Unlike most moves that are planned well in advance, we, my father, mother, and 2 siblings, fled under the dark of night. We had no time to pack. We were fleeing to save our lives. Given that my other extended family in Syria lived in other regions, we did not have time to coordinate an exit strategy whereby we could all gather in safety. As such, we landed here while my other family found safety in the likes of Ukraine, Denmark, and Ireland. During the time of our displacement, we've not been able to gather in one location because of visa restrictions and COVID. The only thing that has kept our family together and united are our mobile devices. Again, stay anchored in the prompt, right? This is not about it's not about Syria necessarily. Syria is helping you argue a point. Every Sunday, we zoom in and first attend a prayer service. Our faith is very important to us, so it is incredible that the mobile world allows our family to share in this experience. Following prayer, we virtually share a meal. Together, we laugh, cry, and share the stories of our lives, all while staying connected as a collective unit. So, do you know how in the thesis statements I said anchor your thesis with just by bringing it back to Steve Cuts? In the conclusion as well, and I just training wheel, just a scaffold for my students that struggle a little bit. I'm like, if you don't know how to do your conclusion in terms of keeping the promise of the first premise, echoing and linking, drop the word Steve Cuts and just link it all back. Steve Cutt's depiction is erroneous because he does not factor this ginormous benefit of the mobile world. Sure, technology can divide people, but for the most part, it helps bind them together. And again, always 10 to 12 sentences. Keep it fluid, supple, cogent, mathematical, computative, lockstep. What you promise here has to come here. Otherwise, you're going to have breaks in the line of reasoning. So hopefully you found this to be useful. Know that if you would like to work more closely with me, I do offer a Teach It Right 5-week mastermind through the good folks at the National Writing Project. So what we do is this. Every 5 weeks, for 5 weeks, we meet. The next session begins September 25th, 2022, and we meet at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So it's always a Sunday evening, and we meet for an hour, and we do that for 5 consecutive weeks. So I thoroughly go over how the templates can be used across the expository modes, and we also do a deep dive into my alternative grading methods and Plato's Plato discussion modality. So if you would like to work closely together, there's a slew of content in that, lots of good stuff. Know that NWP will award you a 10-hour PD badge of completion. Even though it's a 5-hour course, you get 10 hours of completion. So you can check that out at www.teachinghowtowrite.com. That's my webpage, and you'll see links for NWP there. If you would like these slides or just to reach out to bend my ear, you can reach me at teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com. Hope all is well. Happy teaching, happy